Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to this episode of Straight Talk on insights into leaders solving problems. Every week, we ask 3 questions of an expert who can share their insights on how to address some of the burning issues leaders are asking about. Good day. I am Dragasa, and thank you for joining me on this podcast called Straight Talk for Business. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, someone whose work I have followed and hopefully have come to finally understand after nearly 2 decades. His name is Dave Snowden. He is the founder and the director of the Cynefin Center in the UK. Not only is he the founder and director of the center, he's also the author, with some friends, of Cynefin. It is a book with subtitle Weaving Sense-Making into the Fabric of Our World. He has an endorsement on the cover by John Seely Brown, who talks about sense-making with imagination. I'm in conversation with Dave Snowden. To this point, we've been chatting about strategy, and I'm going to now turn it over to Dave and provide a little bit more background on the constraints.
Just to be clear on this, constraints, a lot of people, when you talk about that, think about Goldratt and theory of constraints. In complexity theory, there are governing constraints and enabling constraints. And the enabling constraints are positive, not negative. They shouldn't be got rid of. Because without constraints, as any parent knows, no evolution happens. Yeah. So what we do when we're doing strategy from a complexity perspective, we start off with what are the constraints? And we map those out. Mm-hmm. And then we identify which of the constraints are preventing things and which are enabling things. And then we look at the energy cost of change and the time for change. And then we start to experiment in that space. It's called multiple parallel probes, and start to see what works and what doesn't work, and the things which work we reinforce. If you want a really simple way of explaining this, I've used this a lot lately, it's called the Frozen 2 strategy to management. So if you haven't watched Frozen 2, this is a good excuse to go and watch it, even if you haven't got children or grandchildren.
Right.
The Frozen 1 isn't that good, but by the time they got to Frozen 2, Frozen 1 was so successful, they had the money to indulge themselves. And in the middle of Frozen 2, the real heroine of the movie, who's the younger sister without the magic, sings this beautiful song, all I can do is do the next right thing. And that's now in complexity, go to Kaufman, that's called the adjacent possible. So in a complex world, you map where you are, and you identify what are the coherent pathways you can follow. You follow them without excessive commitment, and then you can respond and view accordingly. And that allows you to manage uncertainty. The minute you start to create 3, 4, 5-year plans with goals, you miss opportunities, and people indulge in gaming behavior, so that they game to achieve the targets. I mean, when I was in IBM and before, managers fought to own things, but we used to call it OMSIS pirates in IBM. So there was this thing called the Opportunity Management System, which was abbreviated to OMSIS. And the idea was you should put all opportunities into that so nobody called on a client twice. But then what you got is OMSIS pirates who surfed that to find things they could claim for their business so they didn't have to do the work. And any big company will tell you similar examples.
Yeah, I'm sure. So with what you were just talking about, uncertainty, in the way I think, that brings me straight away to all of the risks that are down the road. And risk is a huge factor anytime you make a decision. So how would someone be able to use the framework with its quadrants to A, better deal with risk, and B, make better decisions, especially when A, we are inundated with information and yet still have incomplete information? I know that's a lot of question.
It's a big question. So firstly, just as a note, all right, the Cynefin Framework has 5 domains, not 4 quadrants.
The middle. Gotcha.
And the central domain is actually really important because that's what we call aporetic. It's the point where you ask questions which can't be answered easily. Because the trouble is, most times people make decisions based on what's worked before. So you need to challenge that when you're dealing with uncertainty, right? My normal example of that and why this is dangerous. If you give radiologists a batch of x-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final x-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. Now, that's called inattentional blindness. And it's what drove companies like Kodak out of business, because people didn't see what they didn't expect to see. And there are really sound cognitive reasons for this, by the way. It's all part of our evolutionary history. I mean, a lot of our work, to be honest, is identifying outliers. Now, when you're measuring risk, mapping outliers is part of it. So I'll give you a couple of examples. First of all, we make a big difference between systems which are resilient and systems which are robust. Now, a system, the metaphor I would use for that is a difference between a seawall and a salt marsh. So if you build a seawall, you can, it's very efficient. You can drain the land on the landward side. You can use it for agriculture, and everything is fine until the day the design conditions, and then it breaks, and the break is catastrophic. On the other hand, the salt marsh will absorb water. It's constantly changing its shape and its structure, and it doesn't release that water when it's saturated. So a resilient system is designed to survive with continuity of identity over time. So it's designed to fluidly change and structure. Now, one of the things, so there's 3 things we do when we look at risk. One is the degree to which your systems are resilient as opposed to robust. And I don't buy the anti-fragile stuff, by the way, so please don't confuse it with that. Okay. So if you have a high level of robustness, that's cool in stable conditions, but it's very dangerous otherwise. And then you can start to look at the effects of a catastrophic unexpected change. And so that's kind of like one thing we work on. Second thing we do, and this is where we start to use whole of workforce engagement, is to map how different people see the current strategic situation. So we can find the number of outlier views that there are. Now, if there are lots of outliers, it means you don't have any commonness, because everybody will play the game of corporate goals and targets. That won't work. This is indirect. But also, as an executive, you can go and talk to the people who are seeing something that everybody else is ignoring. And this comes from work I did with DARPA on weak signal detection and counterterrorism for about 8 years of my life. So the big issue is to make executives aware when they should look at something. So you can't forecast the future, but you can make people aware when the future is about to change, so they look more carefully. And that's where we use whole of workforce engagement, which has other benefits. The final thing on this, and I think the danger is most corporate strategy works off what's called inductive logic. So 3 types of logic: deductive, inductive, abductive. Deductive, if A, then B. Inductive, all the cases of A have B, so we can assume a correlation. And that's virtually every popular business book. And they confuse correlation with causation. Right? I mean, give you my favorite examples on that. If you want to increase the number of Nobel Prize winners in your country, all you have to do is increase dark chocolate consumption, because dark chocolate consumption directly correlates per head of population with Nobel Prize winners per head of population on a much bigger data set for a much longer time than virtually every management book I've ever read. All right. I mean, the other one I love is that suicides by drowning directly correlate with the release of Nicolas Cage movies, but I can see a reason for that. Yeah. So there are lots and lots of false correlations. Yeah. And some of the really popular management books make that fundamental mistake, or things like Good to Great, where they only look at positive cases. Lean Startup is the same. They don't look at negative cases. Right. And that's just basically 101 failure of research. Now, abduction, which is where we focus, is sometimes great contribution of the American pragmatist to philosophy, sometimes under the logic of hunches. It's what's the most plausible connection between apparently unconnected things. Now, abduction can be measured in quantitative ways, and that's where your risk is, but it's also where your opportunity is. Yeah, and that's a key thing, all right? So if you look at the major innovations in technology over the world, 1945, a Raytheon engineer notices that a chocolate bar melts in his pocket when he's maintaining the magnet of a radar machine. Now, this had happened to lots of Raytheon engineers. They hadn't realized the significance. They just swore and got their trousers cleaned. He realized the significance and put a metal box around the magneto. We got microwave ovens. IBM repurposed punch card technology used for industrial machines to give it first mover advantage in computing. The history of innovation is a history of what we call radical repurposing, or what the biologists call exaptation. Something you're already good at being repurposed for something completely new. Now, that's the upside of thinking abductively, because you can engender abductive clusters where you match, for example, unarticulated needs of clients with your existing capabilities. Because if you can use existing capability for something people don't know what they want yet, that's actually what Apple have always done. Apple never manufactured to market need. They make the market want things the market didn't know they wanted, and then they can't do without. And that actually is a far more successful strategy.
Yeah. Well, and it's been said, there's nothing new to invent, only to repurpose. And that's basically what you say. And so very true. But one thing in all of what you've said, I'm drawn back to something that very, very early on in your work attracted me, and the way I think was all about patterns, and people don't sometimes even recognize they're in a constantly repeating pattern. How does being able to interrupt persistent patterns that are not helpful, how does that concept fit in today's version?
It's really important. And I think it's one of my difficulties with cybernetics, who seem to have this obsession with mapping the patterns and getting you to choose one. And that seems to me to be making the problem worse. Yeah. We have several methods on which you can disrupt patterns. One is the point I made about finding outliers. Yeah? So you might remember when you're a kid, all right, if you get those line drawings, of say a park, and it says in this drawing there are 15 kitchen utensils. So because you're told there are kitchen utensils, you can find them. But if you just said, is there anything unusual, you wouldn't see it. Yeah? So that's one of the key things we focus on. One of the ways you disrupt patterns is to make visible to decision makers people who are seeing the world very differently. Because if you go to an executive and say, look, we've got this cluster of 5% of your staff, and they see the world like this, whereas everybody else sees it like this, executives are then curious. Yeah, and they'll go and talk and see. So curiosity is one of the ways you break patterns. Another way is don't allow people to talk about how things should be. This is the disease of the last 40 years. Yeah. Expensive consultants get executives together. They just put a series of platitudes on the whiteboard. Mission statements became purpose statements, and I think they're now becoming empathy statements because the cycle just carries on, right? And it's the same group of platitudes. It always is, right? And they all decide how things should be, and they try and close the gap. Now, what that does is the patterns of how things should be just keep perpetuating. And it's always 2 years before we solve it. So we've always got an excuse why we're failing. What we do is you map the present and you say, what can we change? In fact, you ask 3 questions. What can we change? Out of the things that we can change, where can we monitor the impact of the change? And out of the things where we could monitor the impact, where can we rapidly amplify success or immediately remove failure? Now, that's a far more pragmatic approach, and it focuses you on a micro level, not a macro level. which actually ironically is a more successful way of handling the big picture.
I love that. Okay, one final question, Dave. In the past year and a half, at least, we've seen article after publication after book coming out talking about the future of work, post-pandemic and so on. And as we well know, we cannot forecast the future. And everyone's looking for collaboration and use your imagination. But that tendency that's been identified in your various domains is that people in leadership positions keep wanting to come back to that command and control, and we can't stay with them.
Firstly, there's nothing wrong with command and control in context.
In context.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the key things. I mean, I do a lot of work with military environments, down at Quantico and elsewhere. And people get military models wrong. Military can delegate authority without loss of status. Industrial moguls can't. Right? So the military model is actually much more adaptive than people realize. A weapons sergeant has authority over a 4-star general in some respects. And I can't see that ever happen in industry, right? So I think, first of all, it's not we need to move from command and control to something else. That's been the devil in the dark for the last 4 or 5 decades of constantly trying to create a new solution, what we call in complexity, a context-free solution in a context-specific world. So the issue is command and control is okay here. Coordination is better there. In fact, one of the things I say about leaders is your role is to coordinate, not decide. Except in a real crisis where you have to make decisions fast, but your decisions to create options open, not to resolve the problem, and then sit back and look again. So it's all in the EU field guide in terms of advice, all right? So first of all, it's not an either or, it's a both and. And one of the things you look in a military environment, and I'll give you 2 or 3 examples of practical things, is crews. So in a military environment or any civil contingency environment, people are trained in role and role expectation, and operating theatre is the same. So there's always a pilot, but the person in the pilot role can change. All right. And that's actually one of the areas we're looking at the moment, because actually crews are not teams and they have higher cognitive capacity than a collection of individuals. The other thing we're doing a lot of work at the moment, this is on cross-silo working. So 2 things. There's a thing we created called a triopticon, which was designed to handle cross-silo conflict and also transdisciplinary work. So it's a highly staged 2-day process in which people come together from different disciplines and different backgrounds. And it can't be dominated by any individual or any group. We spent about 2 years experimenting with it. And that's kind of like in place. The other thing we're doing a lot of at the moment is what we call entangled trios. So I'll give you a couple of examples, one industry, one, I'll give you the public sector one first, then the industry one. What we've been doing on society change is put teenagers together with people from their grandparents' generation. And there's a whole bunch of cognitive neuroscience behind that, by the way, because grandparents tell things to grandchildren they don't tell to children and vice versa. It's a different relationship. Historically, grandparents were the primary child carers. So we put very young idealistic with very old experience and network, and then we put them in a trio with somebody from local government, and we throw 15 trios at a problem and see what they come up with. Now we're doing the same in industry. Somebody who's just joined, with somebody about to retire, with somebody in middle management. We do it in IT, junior programmer, experienced systems analyst, user trained to talk to IT people. So there's a reason for 3 as well. So multiple parallel, diverse experiments. That's one of the other ways that you manage this. So there's a whole bunch of practical tools and techniques. But the final point in this, we've got to stop people talking about the qualities they want to achieve. We need to be a dynamic organization, a progressive organization. We need to be, all of those are what in complexity we call emergent properties. They arise because you do things. And this has been the problem with systems thinking for the past 40 years. They look at something that they think is desirable and they say, let's do that. What they forget is the journey people took to create that quality. So you need to replicate the journey, not the outcome.
Brilliant, brilliant. And, I think as we look ahead the next year or two, I'm reminded of something else that I have read is everybody's focusing on best practice. But I think your position on that is, best practice is past practice.
And if the past is repeating, you still do it. I mean, in Britain, it's best practice to drive on the left-hand side of the road. I don't recommend driving on the right-hand side. Yeah, so again, it's, we have best practice, good practice, emergent practice, and novel practice. And again, people it's this context-free, context-sensitive. And it's this, one of the reasons I created Cynefin, I got really fed up as a general manager than a director. In every 2 or 3 years, another fad cycle. And it wasn't that the old fad hadn't worked, it had just, we'd taken it too far. So there's nothing wrong with business process re-engineering in manufacturing. There's everything wrong with it in services, and so on. So it's both and strategy, and it's knowing the boundaries and limitations, which is key. Yeah.
That absolutely wonderful, brilliant. I wish we had the rest of the day to be able to cover so many more of the principles that you covered in your book. Dave, I want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, sharing your wisdom, and a little view into what we can expect when we actually learn how to deal with complexity. I want to thank you very much for being part of today's conversation.
Thank you for having me.